In 1940, Western Europe was caught between two intertwined conflicts. On one hand, it faced an inter-imperialist war, as Nazi Germany sought to dethrone Britain and France as the leading imperial powers. On a deeper level, another struggle was brewing, a people's war led by workers, peasants, and anti-fascists who were resisting both foreign domination and their own oppressive rulers. This video explores how these two battles unfolded in France during the Second World War. We'll discuss how France's defeat in 1940 was not just a military setback, but a reflection of serious social divisions that had deep roots in the 1930s. We'll outline the rise of the French resistance, how it was influenced by workers' movements and the looming threat of fascism, and how its goals often clashed with those of de Gaulle, the Allies, and ultimately the British and American empires. You'll discover that the liberation of Paris in 1944 wasn't merely about military success, but about competing visions for France's future, the restoration of empires versus the desire for a popular revolution. This narrative encompasses not just battles and commanders, but also strikes, acts of sabotage, underground publications, and class struggles, a society striving to shape its own destiny, even as global powers competed for control. By the end, you'll understand how the distinctions between imperialist warfare and people's warfare were not only blurred, but were in direct opposition, influencing the future not just of France, but of post-war Europe as a whole. The interplay of imperialist and people's wars in Western Europe during the Second World War was closely tied to the aftermath of the First World War, which witnessed a significant clash between the established powers of Britain, France, and Russia against a rising Germany. This conflict brought immense suffering to ordinary people, leading to the 1917 uprising in Russia, where workers and peasants took over properties from the capitalists and landowners, sparking a wave of global revolutionary fervor. Although the power of the working class was only realized in Russia, the ruling elite became alarmed enough to foster a right-wing backlash. In Germany and Italy, the combination of unfulfilled imperial ambitions and post-war class struggles resulted in the rise of aggressive counter-revolutionary movements. Hitler and Mussolini aimed for two main objectives: to create new empires by dismantling the old ones, and to crush working-class organization. In Western Europe, the offensive by the Axis powers represented both a resurgence of imperial dominance and a blatant attack on labor. These dual threats prompted a dual response: conflict between empires and an anti-fascist struggle by the people. Germany's rapid defeat of France in 1940 stands out as one of the most significant moments of the 20th century. A formidable European nation was brought to its knees in merely 6 weeks of blitzkrieg. The conservative thinking of French generals, who remained fixated on the trench warfare of the First World War rather than embracing new technologies, has drawn much criticism. Meanwhile, Hitler's troops utilized aircraft and armored units that navigated through these barriers with alarming ease. Yet this defeat cannot be seen solely through a military lens. The two opposing forces were comparatively matched. Germany had 114 divisions and 2,800 tanks, while France had 104 divisions and 3,000 tanks. France's downfall was also shaped by a backdrop of class struggles at home. In February 1934, far-right groups tried to assault the French parliament, but were repelled by police. During the clash, 15 people lost their lives and 1,400 were injured. Although the riot did not succeed in its goal, it led to the downfall of Prime Minister Daladier. In response, a united left organized demonstrations, signaling their determination to resist fascism. This led to a general strike involving 4.5 million workers. One participant captured the spirit of the moment, saying, "Going on strike is pure joy, the joy of standing before the boss with your head held high, of walking among the silent machines with the rhythm of human life restored." That same year, a Popular Front government came into power. The intertwined nature of anti-fascism, labor activism, and communism prompted some influential figures to perceive the threat posed by Hitler as less daunting than that from Stalin. De Gaulle, who would later lead France, encapsulated this view, noting that some were more focused on opposing Stalin than on dealing with Hitler. This mindset contributed to France's hesitance in the early days of the Second World War. Even after officially declaring war over Poland in September 1939, Britain and France engaged in what became known as a drôle de guerre, or a phony war, marked by minimal military action against Germany. However, they showed no hesitation in opposing Russia's invasion of distant Finland. General Gamelin planned to send troops, but that effort ceased when the Finns sought peace in early 1940. At the same time, the French government launched a crackdown on the Communist Party. Just before the Nazi invasion, around 300 communist municipal councils with nearly 2,800 councillors were suspended. Following extensive police raids, the widely read newspapers L'Humanité and Ce Soir, along with 159 other communist publications, were banned. For the first time, elected officials from the Third Republic were expelled and jailed, with 7 communist leaders facing death sentences. Employers exploited this atmosphere of fear to target the activists and strikers from 1936. Against this backdrop, Germany launched its attack in the summer of 1940. Their strategies were alarmingly successful, but the French government found itself in a dire situation, highlighted by a refugee's observation that a ruling class in any democracy must count on the entire nation, appealing especially to the working class, or else risk making deals with the aggressor to protect its social order. French leaders were fully aware of the stakes. General Weygand, the commander-in-chief, expressed to de Gaulle his fear that the military structure could suddenly collapse, leading to chaos and revolution. He was inclined to surrender, but was troubled by one thought: if only he could be certain the Germans would leave him enough resources to maintain order. Ultimately, putting aside his doubts, Weygand pressured his colleagues to surrender by falsely claiming that Maurice Thorez, the leader of the Communist Party, had instigated a revolution and seized the presidential palace. In the midst of this chaos, Marshal Pétain demonstrated a clear understanding of French history. Since the Revolution of 1789, governments had faced a choice: mobilize the masses to defend against foreign threats, or suppress the people to uphold class dominance. In 1871, when the radical Paris Commune stood firm against German invaders, Thiers collaborated with them to violently suppress the Parisian working class. Fast forward 70 years, Pétain insisted that in the face of Hitler, the only option was to negotiate and, if necessary, crush the resistance, much like Thiers had done before. To bolster resolve, Churchill suggested a Franco-British Union with shared citizenship for all. The French cabinet reacted with sentiments like, "Better to be a Nazi province, at least we know what that means." This wish soon became reality. On June 22, 1940, an armistice was signed with Germany, creating a northern zone under Nazi control. Pétain's Vichy regime governed the southern part of France. Meanwhile, a different perspective had emerged among the working class since the demonstrations of 1934 and strikes of 1936. When the British and French governments appeased Hitler regarding Czechoslovakia, it was met with cheers from the center and right in France's parliament. The leader of the PCF responded by saying, "France has succumbed to blackmail, betrayed an ally, opened the door to German domination, and possibly put her own interests in jeopardy." 535 deputies supported the government's stance, while 75 voted against it, 73 of whom were communists. However, the left was thrown into chaos by the Hitler-Stalin Pact. As Russia and Germany ravaged Poland, PCF leaders called for peace with Hitler. When the Nazis marched into Paris, the PCF declared that French imperialism had suffered its greatest defeat in history. They asserted that the true enemy, often found within in times of imperialist war, had been overthrown. The working class in France and worldwide should view this moment as a victory and realize they faced one fewer enemy. They stressed that it was crucial to ensure the fall of French imperialism was permanent. However, they added a caveat: one should consider whether the French struggle aligns with German imperialism's fight against French imperialism. This was only partially true, as German imperialism was seen as a temporary ally. Not all communists accepted this notion. A third of the PCF's members of parliament rejected the idea that France was under the occupation of a temporary ally. In one sense, the PCF was right. French imperialism had fallen to German imperialism, but it wasn't a complete end. On June 18th, Charles de Gaulle, a young French brigadier general who had made it to London, declared the existence of Free France on the BBC, stating, "No matter what happens, the spirit of French resistance burns bright." De Gaulle's vision for this resistance was quite unusual. He reached out to the French commander-in-chief of North Africa, the High Commissioner of Syria-Lebanon, and the Governor-General of French Indochina to create a council for the defense of the empire. Just a week later, he claimed, "Powerful forces of resistance can be felt across the French Empire." On August 3rd, he reported that at many points in the empire, brave individuals are rising up, determined to protect France's colonies. It's understandable that commanders-in-chief, high commissioners, and governor-generals didn't rush to reply, pushing de Gaulle to reconsider his approach to salvage French imperialism. He added two new elements to his strategy. First, it was essential to drive out the Nazis, and that required mobilizing the masses, but they needed to be kept in check. His initial defense of the empire remained intact. De Gaulle articulated it this way: the enemy's power could only be broken through a prolonged struggle. Those wishing to undermine the effort would try to divert national resistance into revolutionary chaos. Additionally, he noted that major powers would seek to exploit France's vulnerability to advance their own interests. De Gaulle expanded on this by urging France's colonial leaders to directly defend her possessions against the enemy and divert England, and perhaps one day America, from the temptation of claiming them for themselves. Although de Gaulle would become its symbol, the resistance in France grew independently. It started as a chain of solidarity, routes for prisoners escaping the occupier. Soon, networks emerged to relay information to the Allies, followed by movements centered around underground newspapers. In 1941, after Hitler launched his attack on Russia, the PCF joined the fight, and the level of direct action and sabotage significantly increased. In a span of just 3 months, the Communists reported carrying out 1,500 operations. This included 158 acts of sabotage that derailed trains, destruction of 180 locomotives, and 1,200 loads of troops or materials, as well as sabotaging 110 train engines and 3 bridges, leading to 800 German soldiers either killed or wounded. In 1942, an effort to recruit French labor for Germany pushed many young men to join the Maquis guerrilla groups. By 1944, the resistance carried out significant diversionary tactics to support the D-Day landings in Normandy. Engaging in such actions required immense bravery, as resistors faced pursuit by the Gestapo in the north and the brutal milice in the south. The threats of torture, concentration camps, or execution loomed large, and approximately 60,000 members of the Communist Party of France lost their lives. The resistance acted both as a movement and as an organized entity. It was a movement that captured a vast following, with its underground press reaching a daily circulation of 600,000 in 1944, even when reading a clandestine newspaper could lead to Gestapo arrests. Conversely, organized resistors made up no more than 2% of the adult population. Who were these individuals recognized by a prominent northern newspaper as totally uncompromised, proving their worth under German occupation? Though the French resistance has been extensively analyzed, answering that question is tricky, as no one had membership cards. The available evidence often seems conflicting. Georges Bidault, president of the National Resistance Council, noted that the resistance embraced a wide range of people from various backgrounds, including workers, peasants, teachers, journalists, civil servants, aristocrats, and clergy. Most joined after making a personal choice driven by their conscience and desire for revolt. This variety challenges the narrative of an imperialist war waged by the ruling class against a people's war supported by the masses. However, that perspective is flawed. The resistance's diversity arose because the struggle for national independence and the betrayal felt by the ruling class ignited anger among many groups in society. The fight for national liberation intertwined with class struggle, yet the social makeup and perspectives within the resistance were not the same. Despite its broad membership, the group had a distinctly left-wing perspective, largely because the French establishment was deeply compromised by its support for Vichy and German control. While some isolated resistors held right-wing, even extreme right-wing beliefs, fighting against fascism was a more natural fit for left-wing circles since they were already engaged in that struggle. Those who had voted for the Popular Front in France and sought a Republican victory in Spain were quick to oppose both Hitler's Europe and Pétain's France. The Communist Party faction was expected to utilize radical rhetoric, but it wasn't the only one doing so. Other segments of the resistance produced documents that seemingly all echoed a call for revolution. The radicalizing influence of occupation and surrender was evident in resistance literature. One article titled, "This War is Revolutionary," described it as a clash between two worldviews, authority versus liberty. It asserted that the masses wouldn't mobilize unless they understood the goal, which had to be an ideal worthy of their struggles and great enough to inspire ultimate sacrifice, the liberation of humanity. This liberation extended beyond just driving out the Nazis. It included liberation from material constraints like hunger and poverty, liberation from economic oppression caused by wealth inequality, crises, and unemployment, liberation from social oppression stemming from money, prejudice, and religious intolerance, and a challenge to the selfishness of those who possess. Libération, the publication by Dastier, an ex-aristocrat involved with trade unions and socialist groups, echoed these sentiments. They vowed to fight against both internal and external adversaries, including war, national imperialism, economic exploitation, and any form of dictatorship, whether state, social, or religious. These views stood in stark contrast to those of de Gaulle, who was fundamentally authoritarian. His self-stated motto was, "Deliberation is the work of many men, action of one alone." Nonetheless, he recognized the necessity of incorporating radical language into his defense of French imperialism if he hoped to steer the movement. He filled his speeches with statements like this: "In coming together for victory, the French people are also uniting for a revolution. For us, ending the war won't just mean restoring our national territory and empire, it will mean true sovereignty for the people." But his words lacked sincerity, leading to a power struggle between de Gaulle in exile and the resistance in France. Until he was killed by the Gestapo in 1943, de Gaulle's representative was Jean Moulin. He earned respect because, when he was prefect of Eure-et-Loir at the start of the war, the Nazis tortured him, a horrifying ordeal where they locked him in a room with a mutilated corpse, trying to force him to sign a false confession about black French soldiers. Fearing he would give in, he even tried to take his own life. De Gaulle wanted Moulin to ensure that the resistance operated in favor of Imperial France, not the people. His mission was clear: to restore France as a belligerent and prevent her subversion. The first step was to establish control. Moulin was instructed to unify the many resistance groups under a single central authority, otherwise they risked falling into chaos or communist domination. He initially merged southern non-communist factions into the United Resistance Movement. By May 1943, he had created the National Resistance Council, which brought in the communists as well. Moulin's next objective was to ensure de Gaulle's political control over military matters, avoiding ideological disputes. The separation of the movement's political and military activities must lead to an independent military organization linked to London for orders. This would form the hierarchical, secret army that de Gaulle intended to use to diminish the influence of radical elements. Although the resistance agreed to a more organized structure for coordinated action, they strongly opposed separating military and political roles. Freinet from the Muir argued, "The secret army is a fundamental part of the United Movement because it emerged from the whole, defining its structure and recruiting its members." Freinet had a very different perspective on warfare compared to de Gaulle. For us, discipline is built on trust and camaraderie. There's no sense of subordination in the military sense. It's clear from our experience that we can't impose officers at any level within our structure. What might work in a regiment or government office simply doesn't translate here. Different armies adopt distinct strategies, as another resistance leader noted. Some, usually former officers, felt a duty to rally their boys in a traditional military style. Meanwhile, others recognized they were engaged in a revolutionary struggle, even viewing it as an international civil war, focusing exclusively on guerrilla tactics. The debate didn't reach a clear conclusion, leading to the emergence of various militias, from de Gaulle's secret army to the PCF-led Francs-Tireurs et Partisans. Other groups, like the Muar, took a middle ground with varying strategies. The secret army functioned as de Gaulle's instrument, taking a cautious approach, waiting for the general's arrival on D-Day. This stance clashed with the resistance's spirit, prompting Moulin to dispel rumors that suggested any action by the secret army militants would be barred as they awaited D-Day, a truly impractical notion. In contrast, the communist-led movements dismissed this wait-and-see mindset and undertook bold actions, often at significant personal cost. They might have gained the influence de Gaulle feared, which was realized in places like Yugoslavia and Greece, had it not been for the US-led North African invasion in November 1943. The operation went smoothly due to pro-Gaullist officers in Algiers working alongside a resistance group led by the Jewish Abulker brothers, who arrested top Vichy officials and took control of barracks and command posts. Almost immediately after the Americans arrived, they began negotiations with one of the captives, Admiral Darlan, a decision that showed a remarkable insensitivity. Even those sympathetic to the US's actions acknowledged that Darlan, as the chief architect of Pétain's policies, had worked diligently to assure the Axis of France's readiness to cooperate with the Nazi regime. He advocated the very same policies for which Laval, Pétain, and other Vichy leaders were later condemned, with Laval ultimately facing execution. To the French resistance, Darlan embodied collaboration and capitulation. Darlan was chosen as Pétain's successor, yet the US liberated him and handed the government of North Africa back to him. Morgenthau, the US Secretary of the Treasury, quietly expressed his frustration, wondering what the point was in fighting if the aim was to restore such fascists to power. The resistance movement was shocked, although this turn of events was somewhat expected. Roosevelt had kept ties with Vichy from the outset by signing a trade agreement in 1941. Darlan's reinstatement angered the French resistance, who firmly stated they could not excuse the betrayal of their political and military leaders for their past actions. Revenge followed when a resistance fighter assassinated the admiral. The US then shifted its focus to General Giraud, who, unlike Darlan, had not aligned with the Nazis and was admired for his daring prison escape. However, Giraud's views on Pétain, Vichy, democracy, and anti-Semitism were not markedly different from Darlan's. One could argue that Roosevelt aimed to draw Vichy away from Germany, but it seems more plausible that the US sought its own allies to replace the British-supported de Gaulle. Roosevelt made it clear he wouldn't engage with groups that posed as governments, which referred to de Gaulle. Clearly, the United States was willing to align with anyone who would follow their lead, rather than see a competing imperial power rise in France. Operation Torch did not fulfill the Atlantic Charter's promise of self-determination for all peoples. Under Giraud, 7 million Algerians remained under the weight of United States-backed French colonialism and its large population of settlers. Vichy's anti-Semitic laws stayed in place, along with concentration camps that held elected communist deputies, now joined by Gaullists and the very resistance fighters who had helped the Allies land. In mainland France, the Nazis, in response to Operation Torch, dismissed Vichy's facade and took over the entire country. Yet, the shock from the Darlan episode united all resistance factions behind de Gaulle, providing him with a strong enough foundation to sideline Giraud and create a provisional French government in North Africa. The legitimacy granted by the newly established CNR was vital in establishing de Gaulle as the national leader. However, once he solidified his control, he completely disregarded his followers. Moulin was murdered by the Gestapo, and his successor, Bedault, noted that he sent hundreds of coded messages to the French government in exile, receiving only one response: reduce traffic. De Gaulle only chose to engage with his resistance movement during the Normandy landings in the summer of 1944. General Eisenhower sought maximum disruption of the German forces from within France. At great personal sacrifice, the resistance movements fully committed to the fight. In this uneven battle, thousands perished at locations like Vercors, yet the number of fighters surged from 140,000 to 400,000 between June and September. The uprising heavily depended on arms from the Allies, but these were provided in a highly selective manner. Even Freinet, who aligned more with Gaullism than communism, lamented that until just before D-Day, only de Gaulle's direct representatives, who favored inaction over action, received essential radios, funds, and weapons. Additionally, despite some acceleration in parachute drops, the supplies still fell short, attributed to the deep-seated distrust the United States held toward the resistance. Corsica showcased a vision of liberation through a people's war rather than Operation Torch. The island was occupied by German and Italian forces. Following Mussolini's downfall and Italy's switch of allegiance, a widespread resistance movement spearheaded by communists sprang into action. Partisan groups teamed up with Italian troops against the Wehrmacht, resulting in the deaths of 1,000 Germans between September 9th and October 4th, 1943, at the cost of 170 Maquis fighters. An uprising in Ajaccio led to leaders being elected through mass gatherings, refusing to cooperate with any local equivalent of Darlan. We can't defend the island effectively unless true patriots hold the reins of power. We cannot trust a local government that failed to resist in 1940. Let's oust the Vichyists. De Gaulle was troubled, not because Vichy was rejected, but because he wasn't in control. He expressed that he didn't want to see this precedent set in metropolitan France the following day. This contrast between his war and that of the Corsicans unfolded on a much larger scale during the liberation of Paris. By August 1944, Nazi control was crumbling in the French capital due to a restless populace. De Gaulle was concerned that the resistance would seize Paris before imperial forces could arrive. When mass strikes erupted among police, postal, and metro workers in mid-August, de Gaulle instructed them to return to work immediately and keep order until the Allies arrived. However, that command was ignored, and on August 19th, a widespread uprising began. Led by Roll Tanguy, a communist veteran of the Spanish Civil War, 20,000 fighters liberated the city over 8 days, although only about a tenth of them were armed. The German commander, von Choltitz, had orders to destroy Paris rather than lose it. Despite being a veteran of Stalingrad and having caused terrible destruction in Warsaw, he understood that this plan could not be carried out and that his forces could end up trapped and annihilated by the resistance. At a crucial moment, Gaullist representatives offered von Choltitz a chance for a truce, allowing him to evacuate safely if he promised not to destroy the city. As a result, the resistance was instructed to halt fire against the occupiers. This decision infuriated its leaders, with one stating that it was unimaginable to see such a disconnection between the actions of the masses and the elite group that had placed itself between them and the enemy. Amidst this turmoil, the Germans regained the advantage for the first time. On the night of August 20th to 21st, 99 resistance fighters lost their lives, compared to just 5 Germans. The next day, however, the uprising resumed and finished the job that had been dangerously interrupted. It wasn't until the evening of August 24 that regular French troops, specifically General Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division, arrived in the city center. The final count of lives lost in the liberation of Paris stood at 1,483 French and 2,788 Germans. With the hated enemy gone, would earlier divisions fade in the glow of national unity? Not at all. While the victorious resistance awaited de Gaulle at the Hôtel de Ville, a symbol of Parisian rebellion for 3 centuries, the brigadier general was elsewhere. He began by meeting von Choltitz's aide-de-camp, then moved on to key financiers and the director of the Bank of Indochina, before arriving at the War Ministry. It was only after acknowledging the Parisian police, who had assisted the Nazis in keeping order, that he finally went to the Hôtel de Ville. De Gaulle didn't seize the moment to commend the fighters. Instead, he criticized Roll Tanguy for having the audacity to accept the German surrender as an equal alongside the so-called legitimate soldier, Leclerc. This was just a glimpse of what was ahead. 3 days later, de Gaulle met with the resistance again. According to his own words, he declared, "The militias have no further purpose. The existing ones will be dissolved," and after noting the comments from the members of the CNR, I ended the meeting. Soon after, the resistance was disarmed. Though less violent than in Greece, the process was still familiar. The PCF, the main resistance party, accepted Stalin's perspective that France belonged in the Western capitalist camp, leading its fighters to bow to de Gaulle's demands. Different interpretations of the Second World War were further highlighted on the final day of the war in the West. Amid the celebrations on May 8, 1945, French troops fired on celebrating crowds in Sétif, Algeria, resulting in thousands of deaths. It might seem that French imperialism completely crushed the People's War, yet its effects lingered. As resistor Stefan Hessel stated, the CNR program of 1944 established the principles and values that laid the groundwork for our modern democracy, with its extensive reforms in economy, welfare, and education. In 2010, Hessel pointed out that, despite 65 years passing, the current economic crisis threatened the last remnants of that legacy. This observation holds true for much of Western Europe, which enjoyed a post-war social democratic consensus after 1945 and is now being contested again. Unlike France, Britain wasn't occupied by the Nazis, so no radical resistance movement emerged independently from an official government in exile. Signs of class tension were downplayed. Thus, on the brink of war, when Labour's Arthur Greenwood rose to criticize the appeaser and Tory Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, dissenting Tory members of Parliament shouted, "Speak for England," while Labour members of Parliament yelled, "Speak for the workers." In 1940, various groups united to support Churchill as the new Prime Minister. He stated, "This is not a war of leaders or ambitions, it's a war of people and causes." From the Labour side, former Union leader Bevan declared that British Labour would not engage in an imperialist war. The theme of national unity was also reflected in Britain Under Fire, a visual documentation of the Blitz, featuring a photo with the caption, "Their Majesties outside Buckingham Palace, facing the same trials and tribulations." This uplifting image seemed reinforced during Their Majesties' visit to the ruins of Southampton. Reporters described the scene. Thrilled crowds lined the cold streets, echoing with cheers and cries of "God Save the King." However, the dedicated volunteers from Mass Observation, who observed beyond the media's portrayal to assess public sentiment, noted a more typical reaction. If they provided new furniture, good food, and kept things simple, we'd be truly thankful. The reality of modern warfare meant that, even without occupation, the British experienced a disconnect between imperialism and their personal needs, not unlike the situation in France. As one writer expressed, "The front isn't a distant battlefield, it's part of our daily lives, with dugouts and first aid posts on every street and trenches claiming sections of city parks and village greens." In London, the Blitz threatened to shatter the illusion of unity. A senior diplomat privately remarked that there was growing concern in government circles about the resentment in the East End, and it was reported that even the King and Queen faced booing during their visits to bombed areas. He felt relieved when the Luftwaffe targeted the wealthier West End, stating, "If only the Germans had been wise enough not to bomb west of London Bridge, there might have been a revolution here. Instead, they've destroyed parts of Bond Street and Park Lane, which has adjusted the balance." Keeping the narrative that everyone, regardless of wealth or privilege, was in this together, believable, required fostering a collective amnesia. When Churchill took office, he advised his colleagues, "If we start a dispute between the past and the present, we'll end up losing the future." His caution was indeed warranted. He chose a cabinet filled with well-known appeasers like Chamberlain and Halifax, with 21 out of 36 ministerial positions going to those who had previously served under the former Prime Minister. Churchill's own past had some troubling moments too. After visiting Mussolini in 1927, he expressed that he was charmed, like many others, by his gentle demeanor and calm poise. He even told Mussolini, "If I had been an Italian, I would have wholeheartedly supported you in your struggle against Leninism." Fast forward 9 years. During Italy's aggression in Abyssinia, Churchill opposed sanctions against Italy and praised the Hoare-Laval Pact, an effort to appease fascists by conceding large parts of the country, as a very clever, forward-thinking agreement. Nothing Mussolini did could shake Churchill's admiration. Despite the fierce battles in North Africa, culminated by the Battle of El Alamein, when Mussolini fell in 1943, the British Prime Minister claimed that, even when the outcome of the war was clear, the Allies would have welcomed Mussolini. Clearly, taking decisive action against fascism was not his main drive during the Second World War, nor was he concerned with the rights of smaller nations. His disdain for Indian nationalism is a topic for later discussion, but his comments on Irish independence in 1921 were also telling. What a foolish and hideous prospect we face. What a crime we would commit if, for a fleeting escape from worry and strife, we condemned ourselves and our children to such misfortunes. It would tear apart the British Empire. Thus, he believed Ireland must be closely secured with blockhouses and barbed wire. Every individual should be systematically searched and questioned. Yet, Churchill was adamantly against appeasing Hitler and his reign of terror. His resistance to the Führer was constant, motivated solely by the direct threat to Britain's power. Churchill's wartime speeches are rightly renowned, but often, those famous phrases are taken out of context, leaving key sentences unfinished. After each stirring call to arms, there was always a nod to empire. Here are a few examples. I have nothing to give but blood, effort, tears, and sweat, for without victory, there can be no survival. Understand this, there is no survival for the British Empire and for everything it represents. The Battle of Britain is about to commence. The fate of Christian civilization hangs in the balance, as does our own British existence and the enduring legacy of our institutions and empire. So let us prepare ourselves for our duty and conduct ourselves in such a way that if the British Commonwealth and Empire endures for 1,000 years, people will say, this was their finest hour. Churchill was not as straightforward as Amiri, who stated that after securing the defensive Battle of Britain, the Battle of Empire comes next. However, Churchill did assert, we intend to hold our ground. I did not become the king's first minister to oversee the end of the British Empire. The imperial nature of the British government's approach to the war was not just a personal choice. It was guided by both past and current grand strategy. For centuries, overseas colonies demanded a powerful royal navy, and the military budget was divided accordingly. The RAF followed next, while the army, crucial for any conflict with a continental power like Germany, was a distant third. During the decade from 1923 to 1933, the fleet received 58% of spending, the Air Force got 33%, and the Army only 8%. When the Second World War began, just 107,000 of Britain's 387,000 troops were stationed at home. Thus, the expeditionary force sent to the continent could offer nothing more than support to sit through the so-called phony war with the French. When this Sitzkrieg ended in 1940, they had to rush from the beaches of Dunkirk. After that, there was little option but to try to wear down the German war machine from a distance. One historian suggests it was vital to avoid any direct confrontation with the German army anywhere. Encounters with the Wehrmacht were therefore coincidental rather than intentional. One instance was Norway, which Britain aimed to capture before the Nazis, only to find it occupied upon arrival. London's main ground operation was far from Europe, taking place in the Libyan desert to defend the route to India against the Italians. Engagement with the German army only occurred there after the Italians enlisted Rommel's panzer divisions. A new chance to take on Germany under better conditions came in 1941 when Hitler invaded Russia and the USA entered the conflict. With 240 Nazi divisions deployed in the east, while only 50 were stationed in the west, Stalin urgently requested soldiers to be sent across the Channel to open a second front. When Britain hesitated, some remarked that it seemed willing to fight to the last drop of Russian blood. Churchill, in a sulky yet factual response, stated that the Russians had no right to blame us. They brought this upon themselves with their pact with Ribbentrop, which unleashed Hitler on Poland and ignited the war. He also criticized the Soviets for acting solely out of self-interest, disregarding the rights of smaller nations, which was precisely what Britain and France were fighting for, alongside their own interests. This came from a government that delayed the Second Front, citing the vast distances British troops were stationed across, from Gibraltar to Calcutta. The need to maintain forces in the Middle East and secure a line from the Caspian to the Western Desert was also emphasized, alongside the challenge of keeping strength at home while supplying units abroad in places like Iceland, Gibraltar, Malta, Aden, Singapore, and Hong Kong. Many were not convinced when Churchill touted Operation Torch, the landings in French North Africa, as fulfilling Britain's obligations to Russia. Britain's main strategy reflected a typical imperialist attitude during wartime, disregard for human life, especially among civilians. It involved area bombing, meaning the RAF would target German cities indiscriminately rather than specific military sites. This approach had been hinted at back in 1932 by then Prime Minister Baldwin, who starkly noted that because the bomber always gets through, the only defense was to be offensive. You had to kill more women and children faster than the enemy if you wanted to survive. He mentioned this so people could understand what awaited them in the next war. Despite initial hesitations, Churchill adopted this tactic in 1940, recognizing that we lack a continental army to take on the Germans directly, but one thing will force them back and bring them down: a devastating, exterminating assault by heavy bombers. Bomber Command put this into action. The focus was on populated areas, rather than military sites like dockyards or factories. It was imperative to make this clear. The reality was that around 3/4 of the bombs fell on civilian targets, with the aim of displacing 25 million people, resulting in 900,000 deaths and over 1 million injuries. Some have argued that practical considerations made area bombing necessary. Due to strong German anti-aircraft defenses, daylight raids on military targets came at a high cost, but attacks at night struggled to hit those exact targets. As a result, major cities became the more viable option. However, the British military's technical capabilities were deeply intertwined with the Empire, making them inseparable. Even if area bombing had been seen as the only option, it lost its justification after the landings at Normandy in the summer of 1944. Still, under Arthur Bomber Harris, the campaign continued without pause. He claimed his crews had nearly obliterated 45 of the 60 largest German cities, maintaining an average of devastating 2.5 cities each month, despite the focus on the invasion. On February 13, 1945, British and U.S. bombers unleashed a firestorm, wiping out Dresden's cultural heart, including 19 hospitals and 39 schools, while leaving crucial military and transport facilities unscathed. Between 35,000 and 70,000 people perished, with only about 100 being soldiers. The bombing only stopped when Churchill recognized that there would be nothing left to exploit after the war. He noted they would take control of a ruined land, realizing that resources needed for rebuilding would not be available if everything was completely destroyed. Eventually, he advocated for a more targeted approach focusing on military goals like oil and communications, instead of indiscriminate terror and destruction. Was there an argument to be made that this suffering hastened the fall of Nazism? It was suggested that area bombing would sap morale and slow production of weapons. Yet, Germany's industrial output actually increased under the bombardment, rising significantly from January 1942 to July 1944. Rather than weakening morale, the German populace became more resolute. Hitler's armaments minister noted that the anticipated loss of 9% of production capacity was offset by a surge in effort. Max Hastings emphasizes that Bomber Command's main role and achievement lay in rallying the British public and their allies, rather than inflicting harm on the enemy. The eventual German defeat was largely attributed to the Red Army, which engaged in vital battles such as Stalingrad and Kursk. Soviet military casualties reached 13.6 million out of 20 million soldiers, resulting in a staggering attrition rate of 68%. In contrast, British military strength was 4.7 million, with 271,000 casualties, equating to an attrition rate of 6%. The decision to delay opening a second front until the Soviet Union was achieving victories on its own, coupled with the deliberate targeting of civilians with minimal military gain, starkly reflects Churchill's approach to the war. His administration was primarily focused on showcasing Britain's status as a great power, a priority not shared by the general public. Many writers pointed out that the conflict represented a battle between two opposing ideals, humanism and anti-humanism. The war was fundamentally about embracing a way of life rooted in love rather than power. Observers noted that the public was largely free from the jingoistic fervor of the First World War, observing, "There is no gushing, sweeping away dynamo of patriotism, no satisfied gush of the primitive, the hidden violent." This should not be mistaken for indifference. In 1938, 75% of respondents felt confused or had no opinion on foreign affairs. By 1944, 85% had clear views, with a strong majority favoring international cooperation. Ordinary citizens recalled how the abandonment of appeasement abroad coincided with declines in living standards at home, leading them to seek action against the domestic little Hitlers who had waged an attack on labor. In Glasgow, a 1941 mass observation study revealed that workers felt their employers were only interested in saving themselves, with little regard for the men or anything else. Some even believed employers might prefer being under Hitler, reflecting how left-wing ideas had shaped perceptions of the employer as a friend to fascism. Drawing on experiences from the First World War, many were anxious about what the Second World War would bring. A satirical book from 1940 warned that if the establishment had its way again, the so-called People's War could easily turn into a regressive return to a classist England unchanged. Mass observation noted that workers weren't necessarily against the war or pushing for peace. They desired involvement just as much, but simultaneously were engaged in a struggle of their own. Most weren't fighting to preserve the Britain of the 1930s or its colonial authority. A mass observer in 1944 pointed out that people prioritized fixing the issues that had previously gone wrong, mainly job security and decent housing. Rather than engaging in area bombing and maintaining the empire, ordinary folks were seeking a fight for justice and respect. Interestingly, those living in cities heavily impacted by the Blitz were the least supportive of retaliatory actions. In London, where 1.4 million found themselves homeless, only a small fraction wanted to fight back. Comments gathered by mass observers highlighted how regular people's opinions often contradicted the government's stance, advocating for an armed League of Nations to lead to socialism, ensuring every worker could live comfortably after the war, and believing that financiers were running the war for profit, suggesting it would end when they were satisfied. The Labour Party tried to connect the gap between the Imperial War and the People's War. As shown in Bevan's somewhat perplexing remarks about England's historical role in granting liberty and its extensive empire built over several centuries. However absurd, these statements reveal a consciousness of both wars. British communism faced even more complexities. When war broke out, Harry Pollitt led the movement and strongly supported the concept of a people's war. He argued that regardless of the motives of Britain and France's current rulers, stepping back from this conflict and merely offering revolutionary slogans while fascism rampaged across Europe would betray all that those before us fought for over many years against capitalism. This stance contradicted the Hitler-Stalin Pact, leading to Pollitt's replacement. By October 1939, the Communist Party's manifesto began to call for a unified people's movement to demand an immediate end to the war, to bring down the Chamberlain government, and to prepare for new elections that would establish a government committed to immediate peace. However, by June 1941, the party shifted its position again, backing the anti-fascist effort but without any mention of a fight against capitalism. Pollitt returned to advocate for unity among all who opposed Hitler, stating that the struggle wasn't against the Churchill government and affirming that this had become a people's war. Though his definition diverges from the one used in this discussion, these shifting interpretations illustrate the challenge of aligning the ideas of a people's war with an imperialist war. the business leaders were also divided. This was evident in discussions about joint production committees, which aimed to foster collaboration between workers and employers. The director of the Engineering Employers Federation declared he would not allow shop stewards to dictate production issues. Conversely, another managing director argued that if the industry didn't prepare for revolution, a revolution would occur anyway. He insisted that the only way to avert it was to anticipate and meet the needs of the people, embracing the significant changes that would inevitably come if they didn't act first. On the workers' front, the Manchester District Committee of the Amalgamated Engineering Union cautioned wisely that they were operating under a capitalist system that was even more organized for exploitation than it had been in peacetime. Employers will relentlessly seize every advantage that collaboration and relaxed trade union oversight can offer throughout the industry. For workers, this truly feels like a battle on two fronts. Despite these concerns, it was concluded that joint production committees should be backed to boost production and thwart a Nazi victory. This dilemma is perhaps illustrated by a perspective shared by a mass observation volunteer in 1944. Away from selfishness. In Britain's factories, men and women put in long hours, not for a boss, not for anyone's personal gain, but for everyone. The strong conviction that the people's will could influence the course of the Second World War was not merely theoretical. With 30% of the male workforce enlisted and an insatiable demand for industrial output, ordinary people felt a new sense of economic power and confidence. Evidence of this was everywhere. When homeless individuals in London crowded into underground stations for shelter, the government initially protested, but eventually relented. Calder recounts how Father John Grosser, a notable figure during the Blitz, took matters into his own hands by breaking into a local depot. He lit a bonfire outside his church and provided for the hungry. There wasn't a cabinet minister or official willing to oppose him or question this illicit action. In another borough of London, a Ministry of Food official found a crowd of neglected homeless people. He broke into an apartment building, took them in, procured furniture through various means, arranged for utilities, and brought them food. The conflict between these two wars was most acutely felt. The Communist Party's push for maximum production drove it to do everything possible to avoid stoppages, and industrialists thankfully honored them with positive feedback. However, an alternative view was voiced at a shop stewards meeting, where someone referenced the appeasement of Hitler in Munich in 1938, noting that there were still Municheers in both the government and business. This skepticism was clearly a prevalent sentiment, and the public frequently sided with the workers during industrial conflicts. The Communist Party's connections to Russia elevated its status significantly, which helped balance out the impact of losses from opposing strikes. However, this position opened the door for other political groups to tap into the frustrations of workers. Although the Trotskyist movement was quite small, its stance on the war allowed it to spearhead a wave of strikes far exceeding its membership. Historians from this movement note that British Trotskyists made a clear distinction between the capitalist defense of the war and that of the workers, driven primarily by the progressive aim of safeguarding their own organizations and democratic rights from fascism. In the early months of the war, there were 900 strikes, and by 1944, that number had surged to 2,000, leading to 3.7 million lost production days. This occurred despite concerted efforts from Labor, the Communist Party, and Regulation 1AA, which was nearly a prohibition on strikes, and has been labeled the most potent anti-strike tool any government has had since the Combination Acts of 1799. One historian notes that the level of activity and debate grew substantially, sometimes providing a foothold for some far-left agitators, although many of these figures were premature in calling for a second front at home. The radicalism of this time didn't compare to that of the First World War due to the complex nature of the Second World War. Still, the notion of a second front at home carried significant implications. Meanwhile, Britain's army in the Middle East faced its own battles as it sought to protect Egypt and secure the sea route to India, a vital asset of the empire. The commanders have been characterized as mostly upper-class Englishmen, tall and formal, often attending dinners in the same fitted crimson trousers they wore during the Crimean War. Nearly all had gone to the same elite public schools, and the Sherwood Rangers from Nottingham, led by the Earl of Yarborough, even attempted to bring a pack of foxhounds with them to Palestine. However, the elite training grounds of Eton proved insufficient for the realities of total war. The surrender of Tobruk was the largest British defeat after Singapore during the Second World War, and German tanks came alarmingly close to Cairo, just 10 kilometers away. The morale of Britain's desert rats needed a quick boost, so Field Marshal Montgomery inspired his troops by giving them a reason to risk their lives. The newly established Army Bureau of Current Affairs, staffed mostly by progressive educators, aimed to turn the Second World War into a fight for the people. While the King's regulations prohibited soldiers from engaging in political activities, the charged atmosphere of the time made it easy to blur the lines between current events and politics. A movement among rank-and-file soldiers emerged, expressing itself through numerous information sheets and wall newspapers that advocated for a people's war rather than an imperialist one. The founding statement of the soldiers' anti-fascist movement proclaimed their commitment to maximizing the war effort, highlighting any laziness or reactionary elements in the armed forces, with a focus on anti-fascist news. They aimed to do everything possible to hasten victory over fascism, which should lead to a people's peace. That soldiers were openly discussing military policy was already seen as insubordination, especially with calls for a second front against Churchill's reluctance. However, it went even further. Allied rhetoric claimed this was a struggle for democracy, leading some soldiers to believe democracy should also be practiced by those on the front lines. A mock soldiers' parliament was formed in Cairo in late 1943, distinctive for its lack of officer interference, functioning as a parliament of other ranks in the tradition of the English Revolution. The proceedings of this assembly can be understood through the bills it proposed. One bill advocated for public ownership of businesses, and by December 1st, the distributive trades were nationalized. This was followed by an inheritance restriction bill. There were also proposals for granting independence to India, abolishing private schools, and nationalizing coal, steel, transport, and banks. An election via mass meeting was conducted, resulting in the joint Labour-CP ticket winning 119 seats, Commonwealth gaining 55, Liberals 38, and Conservatives only 17. Meanwhile, in the actual Parliament at Westminster, a Conservative MP proposed allowing off-duty soldiers to participate in politics. He maintained that it could do no harm and might bring about significant benefits, and that it should be rightfully his if we are genuinely fighting for democracy. Unsurprisingly, this genuine proposal faced defeat. An imperial war needs a compliant army that follows the commands of the ruling class without question. Those who championed the People's War had to be silenced. In February 1944, the Commander-in-Chief of Middle East Forces mandated that the name of Parliament should not be mentioned. There should be no publicity, not even for war correspondence, and that everything must be overseen by an education officer from the army. When this was announced to the Cairo Parliament, soldiers reacted with protests, 600 against 1. That single vote belonged to the brigadier who delivered the order. Members of the organizing committee were swiftly transferred, as was the new prime minister. Leo Abs, who had advocated for bank nationalization, was put under open arrest and sent back to Britain. This forces parliament was disbanded, restoring the previous order. Still, discontent simmered. When news of Labour's election win in Britain reached Egypt in 1945, soldiers stopped saluting their officers for about 10 days. Real anger erupted after victory over Japan Day in August 1945, when soldiers realized that the battle against the Axis hadn't ended the war. If the government viewed the Second World War as a fight against fascism, demobilization should have started on the day of enemy surrender. However, Labour refused to bring the exhausted troops home. Bevan informed the Commons in November 1945 that it is the intention of His Majesty's government to protect British interests wherever they may be found. British troops were to continue fighting for the British Empire and for the empires of those still unable to fight for themselves. France and Holland. Their Vietnamese and Indonesian colonies would have to be forcibly returned to their rightful owners. Some servicemen had different plans. They chose to strike rather than transport Dutch soldiers to Indonesia. 700 RAF personnel briefly mutinied in Jodhpur, India. By the end of 1945, protests erupted in Malta, followed by Ceylon, Egypt, and again India, where a new forces parliament had been established. In March 1946, a radar operator received a 10-year sentence linked to RAF strikes in Singapore, and in May, a full-scale mutiny took place in Malaya, resulting in numerous court-martials. Britain's industrial strikes and military mutinies, while highlighting the presence of parallel wars, were generally limited events. More often than not, the struggle between those in command and those following orders was hidden, existing as conflicting thoughts within people's minds. Many ordinary folks simply wanted to get by without taking sides in either of the two wars. The reality for the poor, bloody infantry has often been described as a mix of coercion, inducement, and numbness. A Yorkshire woman's feelings surely echoed those of many civilians. She reflected on watching hundreds of bombers take off at regular intervals, saying, "They've just crossed the edge of England, and many won't return. They're just heading out to die." She thought of all the innocent lives being lost because of their actions and wondered when it would end. It felt so meaningless. What was it all for? The despair for everyone caught in this brutal war was palpable, and there was a deep wish for it to be over. Yet, there were undeniable signs that many, perhaps even most, viewed the war quite differently than the powers that be. A notable instance was the reaction to the 1942 Beveridge Report, which laid the groundwork for the post-war welfare state and the National Health Service. Calder rightly points out that the scheme wasn't nearly as groundbreaking as Beveridge and some of his supporters portrayed it. For instance, contributions were flat-rated, meaning the poor paid just as much as the wealthy, and it really only offered a safety net. Even so, after the initial interest faded, the government went to great lengths to suppress any official promotion of the report. A summary written by Beveridge for servicemen was pulled just 2 days after release, deemed controversial and therefore against King's regulations, while Churchill saw the report as a distraction from the war. Interestingly, despite all of this, as mass observation revealed, the general public regarded it as a symbol of Britain's wartime objectives. No other government publication has ever sold 635,000 copies or gained the approval of 90% of those surveyed. Even the Times noted that the public would not accept the misleading separation between these goals and the goal of victory. The overriding issue of the 1945 general election was the true objective of the war, whether it was to create a better, more equal, and fairer world through a welfare state or to revert to pre-war conditions. Churchill clearly wished for a khaki election, reminiscent of the one that brought Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of the First World War, back to power. He urged the public to vote national, with much of his keynote speech subtly criticizing welfare. Here in Old England, on this glorious island, the cradle and fortress of freedom worldwide, we do not desire to be regimented and controlled with every aspect of our lives dictated for us. He warned that Labour's welfare state would inevitably lead to some form of a police state. In response, Attlee invoked the idea of a people's war. He emphasized the crucial question for voters: should this nation be governed by the principle that public welfare takes precedence over private interests, or should we return to the old ways? He urged the voters of Britain, who had shown the world how a great people can rescue themselves in dire times, to grant Labour the power to guide us toward a peaceful and just society. Even if Labour ultimately fell short of many promises, the key takeaway is that it embraced the spirit of a people's war. The election results spoke volumes. Churchill's Conservatives lost seats, falling to 213 MPs, while Labour surged ahead with 393 MPs, claiming its first majority government. The coalition government had fought an imperial war, yet for millions of voters, the aim of that struggle felt entirely different.